Hi everyone. This is the presentation on suicide prevention in a virtual world. Just making sure you're in the right place. If you were looking for this presentation or a different presentation, that's where we're at. Um, so the three presenters, and we do have slides on them, but first is myself. I am a student here at the Chicago School. I am in my last year. I am a graduate assistant with the school. And like I said, I'm a student. I'm currently starting my fieldwork experience. I'm in my practicum at Stetson University, the Stetson University Counseling Services. So approximately 40% of our incoming clients here are in crisis. They're crisis clients. And that's actually something I'm really passionate about, is helping those who, and crisis is a lot of, depression, and they're considering suicide, or maybe they experienced a trauma. There's other things, but those are a lot of what the crises entail. And so my passion issues or areas of expertise, I guess, are depression, anxiety, stress, some self-esteem building, suicidal ideation, and trauma. I try to use an integrative and holistic approach, and I really try to focus on multiculturalism, so that I can better understand a person as an individual and then assist them with their unique needs.
That's me. I'm Angela Presto. I am also here at Stetson with Grace. I am a student at Rollins College here in Florida. I'm in my last semester, graduate in May. And I just listed a few things I'm interested in. Obviously, it's not limited to those because counseling is endless. But crisis counseling, trauma, I love psychosis, severe mental illness, eating disorders, also multiculturalism, super important, so throw that in there. And kind of everything and anything, pretty open to whatnot. But yeah.
Our graduation's coming up next month. We're very excited.
I'm ready.
Hey everybody, so I'm Nicole Pizza. I'm the training coordinator at Stetson University. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist and a national certified counselor. So I'm Grace's direct site supervisor, and then I help Angela out too, just as a training coordinator. I've had a lot of different settings that I have had experience in. So hospitals with involuntary and voluntary hospitalizations. I've worked at the county branch jail, also worked at substance abuse residential facilities. I specialize in trauma, but I can work with a lot of different type of issues. And I'm also a personal trainer. So I try to bridge all different wellness together, kind of the mind, body, spirit approach.
Yeah, so as Grace said in the beginning, this is basically for suicide assessment management. So we broke it up into 4 sections, as we call the 4 pillars of virtual risk management, and we'll cover all of those today. The first one covers establishing clear protocols and communication of confidentiality, its limits, and the setting the clients are in, which looks a little different in the virtual setting. Then we'll walk through determining and treating suicidal driving factors. The third piece would be initiating and facilitating a safety plan virtually with the client. And the last step is understanding different options for hospitalization. I know Nicole, I believe, will talk about that because it's a bit different depending upon where you reside in.
So the first piece of this is definitely to know your state's laws. So because this conference has people from all over America and other countries too, it's really important to know what you have going on in the place that you're located. So for us in Florida, an example could be our Baker Act law, which is a form of involuntary hospitalization. At our site for Stetson University's Counseling Center, we have virtual paperwork, which is something new since we've gone to virtual counseling. So all of the paperwork is done online, including the informed consent with collaborators. Grace is going to talk more in depth about collaborators, but those are kind of like emergency contacts. Collaborators, just a better term for it, a little bit more inviting. And then also to create a protocol with the client, your first session if you get disconnected. So we do our sessions through Teams. I know there's a lot of different platforms that people use. Sometimes some people can't use audio. I mean, they can't use video, sorry. So they're only using audio. So there are different elements that you have to bring up with your clients. Let's say that we get disconnected. It's important to come up with a plan the first time you meet with them. So for example, let's say we get disconnected. I'm going to try to join Teams again. If you don't join in a certain amount of time, then I'm going to call the number that you gave me permission to call that's on file. And then if you don't answer that call, then I'm going to email you the email you have on file. So it looks a little different for each person that you see, but it's important to come up with that protocol with your people. And then when you are meeting with them, each time ensuring their location and the confidentiality of the location. So the awesome thing about virtual counseling is that people can do it anywhere. Also can be a barrier too, because sometimes people will want to do their session when they're in their car with their friends or somebody's driving them somewhere. Sometimes if they're in a coffee shop with a lot of people. So these are things to think about and decide, what you think is a confidential place. But just making sure that they feel safe and they feel like they're in a private place where they can speak freely.
Okay, so for the collaborators piece, this is, I believe it's directly taken out of our paperwork here at Stetson, where it says my consent to teletherapy services includes the identification of 2 local or on-site collaborators. A collaborator is someone I know and trust and who would be a contact person that can be reached by the teletherapy provider if there's any concern for my physical or emotional well-being. Such collaborators may be called upon to contact me or to alert local authorities in an emergency situation. So there's some things that are really important about that. And I do try to stress it to my clients because a lot of times when they do the informed consent, they don't always want to give collaborators because, with a negative mental health stigma, a lot of people don't want others to know that they're in counseling. So we try to let them know the only reason why we would call these people is if we get disconnected and we're really worried about your safety, particularly, if there's self-harm or suicidal ideation, that's when we would be contacting these collaborators. That's the reason why we have them. That's also why we say 2 local or on-site collaborators there, because, we are in a very small part, like a more rural part of Florida. And so their parents are often their collaborators, but their parents are not on site and might not be able to check if the student is okay. So that's why we really do look for local. And then we ask, their name, what's the relationship to the client, their phone number and email addresses are all located we put our collaborators on the informed consent form.
Awesome. So next thing is assessing suicidal drivers. Where's your suicidality at? What is it? It's a very, as you can tell from the title, it's a very fluid process. There isn't okay, first ask this question, then ask that. You use this process throughout and intertwine it in kind of everything you do. So just a general example is the predispositioning engaging point where, you know, you are meeting the client. This is when you're first engaging with them and you're establishing that therapeutic bond that I hope we all know is very, very, very important. And you're setting those clear expectations, like what can you expect from counseling? You know, and that can be the time where, as Nicole and Grace went over, talking about the collaborators, talking about the informed consent. Usually that's always first and foremost. You know, and then obviously they came in for a reason. So what's the problem? Explore the problem with the client, you know. You want to communicate your concern as well, because it definitely indicates that you care and you're here for them. And something that can be helpful is identifying 3 supports. So they usually are psychological, logistical, and social. So, you know, what's a support or coping mechanism that helps you psychologically? What's one that helps you logistically? You know, and what's one that helps you socially? A lot of people I know, their supports usually are like, oh, I like to do face masks or coloring, and I like to hang out with my friends. You know, being able to drive myself places. As you're exploring the problem, you know, seeing like what's going on, you really want to examine the alternatives. So, you know, that's kind of sometimes where that miracle question comes in. Is there a time this hasn't happened? You know, are there situations where people you know who might care about you that you can reach out to? And going through that, you want to make sure you help the client to plan and reestablish control, especially if they're in a crisis situation. It allows for a lot of autonomy and mobility. So really, you're helping them to identify various resources they have for immediate support in that moment, and using some of those alternatives and coping skills you talked about throughout problem exploration and really implementing them. Because I think I'll note this later, you know, in this type of situation, when you're assessing for suicide, thoughts of killing yourself, you really want to move the client to action, and maintenance usually comes later, at a later point. But throughout this, you have to obtain commitment, you know. Someone won't do something unless they want to. So you really want to collaboratively work with the client to make sure whatever you decide to do, they are open and willing to do it. You know, if lethality is involved, whether that's hurting themselves or maybe someone else, you will need a stronger commitment, and, you know, maybe have to go into, as Grace will talk about later, safety planning. And you always, always, always want to follow up. You know, decide on a time frame. How long will it be? Will you follow up in a few minutes, hours, days, weeks? You also want to inquire about their ability to maintain mobility, to maintain that action and equilibrium, which might dictate when you need to follow up. If you think, oh, I don't think they'll be good for a week, follow up sooner with them. So yeah, and you just want to also reinforce that you are there for their support, which I'm sure is why we all got into this field anyway. So we can go to the next slide. So there are some approaches to assessment and treatment. I know personally for me, it definitely helps to take a directive approach. When you're assessing for lethality, suicidality, even homicidality, you don't want to skirt around the point, you know, just ask about thoughts of killing yourself, ask about thoughts of harming yourself, ask about thoughts of hurting others. You know, is there ideation? Is there an intent? Is there a plan? Is there a means? And it kind of goes back to, if, you know, it's very serious and there is high lethality involved, more implications might need to be taken. But an important thing to remember is always ask these 3 questions separately and really differentiate between self-harm and killing oneself, because if you ask them together, it can sometimes confuse the client, and they're like, oh, well, killing myself, harming myself, which one do you mean? And they might not give a very concise answer. The key to this is just be to the point and be concise to hopefully receive the most concise, honest answer. And then, yes. So continuing with approaches to assessment and treatment. Two things I've listed here is the Triage Assessment, which this is a Likert scale of like 1 to 10. And basically it looks at your affective, cognitive, and behavioral functioning. So it'll ask questions based on those indicators, and it can allow for the implementation of proper interventions. So, maybe a client has more difficulties with their cognitive functioning or behavioral functioning. So by using this, you can see maybe where's an area that needs more attention and focus, and what interventions will help with that. And then there's also CAMS, which is the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. So this, again, assesses suicide risk, but the really cool thing about it is it actually has a component in it where it allows for the creation of a safety plan. So you kind of get like everything in one go. You can do the assessment and you can see where the client is in lethality and all that, and also create the safety plan right then and there if needed. And then motivational interviewing. I know motivational interviewing is usually thought of for substance abuse, but it can be really, really helpful actually when you are in crisis situations and assessing for suicide. So the reason being is because you want to, again, motivate your client to action, to be mobile. So you're moving them from immobility to mobility. And like I said before, maintenance occurs later. This is in the moment, what do we need right now? So you're really moving that client from like the pre-contemplation stage to contemplation to planning and action. You also obviously utilize basic counseling skills, that genuineness, empathy, unconditional positive regard. You can't just be a robot and maybe intimidate your client. You need to show them that like you care and you are there for them. And developing discrepancy. I know I mentioned earlier the miracle question, looking for the exceptions. Also, what's different now? Maybe it's like, oh, this is why you're in crisis. This is what's going on. And rolling with resistance. So working with the client and not against them. And it could be that the client really isn't resistant. It most likely might be that what you're doing might just not be working. So try something else. If it's working, great. If not, do something different, whatever that might be, dependent upon the client. And then offering support, as literally is our job. So ORS is a great one to remember. Open questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarizing. Let the client know you're following them and that you are paying attention. And then some things to keep in mind, like I said before, taking that directive approach, because this can be a matter of life or death, and you want to make sure the client is getting what they need. So what's the most pressing matter? The other matters can most likely wait. How long has it been occurring? Because if it's new, maybe they haven't had time to process things yet. Or maybe this has been occurring for a really long time, which then kind of begs the question of like, well, how'd you make it this far? What have you been doing? The client also may be utilizing feeling words to indicate needs that aren't being met. So, I think we've all had people who say like, I'm really sad, I'm upset. And it's like, well, what need of yours isn't being met then? Because a lot of times with suicidality, you can find that it ties into certain needs of someone isn't being met. And then multiculturalism. You really want to pay attention to how you're speaking to the client, the interventions, the techniques you're using are going to be beneficial for them and their own beliefs and views. And as we said before, it could lead to safety planning and or hospitalization, which I know Grace and Nicole will talk about.
So the first thing that, before we decide a safety plan, it's when do you want to use it? It's based on a lot of different things. A lot of what Angela said. If you had used that ahead of time, that utilizing those approaches are really going to help you determine the safety plan. you could also use other assessments. Some of those assessments might be formal, such as we at Stetson, we use the CCAPS, which was created by the CCMH. I believe it's the Collegiate Council of Mental Health or something very close to that. And so it's an assessment that is made specifically for college students. Something that's used very frequently by medical professionals would be the PHQ-9, which also assesses for suicidality. Another common one is Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. This is by no means an exhausted list of assessments that you could use, formal assessments you could use. Another assessment that you could an informal type is the directive approach that Angela was just talking about. Particularly just directly asking the questions when they come in, for us, because when they come in for a crisis appointment or an intake, these are the questions that we often ask just to make sure. And I wouldn't just fall on the assessment results. Something that we say here, the CCAP specifically asks on a scale of 0 to 4, how frequently do you have suicidal thoughts? Do you think about killing yourself? And even if the student answers a 0, we still want to ask them that question because we understand that not everyone wants to write it down. They don't know who has access to that information, but this is our one-on-one time together. No one else is here and they might be more willing to talk about it. So definitely making sure you're asking the question and deciding. And even then, when I ask them about, are you thinking of killing yourself? I'll then explain what passive suicidal ideation is versus active suicidal ideation. Passive suicidal ideation, if you're not aware, might be something more like, I wish I was dead. I wonder what the world would be like if I wasn't around. Would people really miss me? Active suicidal ideation is more like, I want to kill myself. They possibly have a plan of how to do that. And that's when you would definitely be wanting to use a safety plan or considering hospitalization, depending on those answers that come about from those questions. And that's why I put clinical judgment there of when you go on to the safety plan. Because in the end, a safety plan is never going to hurt. But there's definitely times that you want to make sure that you're using it. So now we're actually going to go into it. So when you are doing this virtually, it is incredibly important to collaboratively create the safety plan. For us, it's even better if you have the client fill out the form themselves and then share the screen so that you can go with them step by step and see their answers as they're going, but you're working on it together. Because again, this is a virtual format. We're not sitting side by side. I don't want this person to be pretending to make a safety plan. I need to see it. So that's what sharing the screen is for. If they have a problem with sharing the screen for virtual reasons, I can fill it out for them and share the screen, or fill it out for them and email, whatever we have to do. But the best option, and what I've used a few times, is for them to fill it out and me to kind of just see it. The very end for our safety plan, and I will show it to you in just a moment. The first thing is we list the warning signs that a crisis is developing. So include those thoughts, images, moods, situations, behaviors that come up just before those thoughts of like, I'm going to kill myself come up. Some people, it might be an external event. So let's just say they've dealt with trauma, and so they were raped. Like if they come across their rapist, like that might be a trigger for them. Maybe it's just like a clouded mind, which I've had someone say to me before. That's what precipitates it. It's different for every person, but have them list what those warning signs are. Next, you want to put all the support people in one location. And so you put them and their contact information. So don't just list the names, you put the phone number in there, and you can do 1 to 3 of each. I would put in a therapist or another professional for the first ones, family members. And, sometimes people aren't close to their parents, so it might be cousins or aunts or something like that. And then there's also friends, put 1 to 3 of each of those. And at the bottom, we have hotline numbers that are included on our safety plan. And And that's what that picture is. This is what is on our safety plan, these numbers. It's the National Suicide Hotline, the Volusia County Mental Health Hotline, and then we are physically located in DeLand, the city, so their police department is also available on the plan. After we have the support people and their contact information, we work on listing distraction coping skills. What do they like to do that will just distract themselves? Some people like to go for a walk. Scrolling through TikTok or Instagram are particularly popular distraction coping skills for our population at Stetson, but it could be different for different people. I have one person that I know who their distraction coping plan is to watch Star Wars, and I know Nicole's gonna like that, but that's her distraction. Like when she's feeling really bad, if I watch Star Wars, it distracts me from my bad thoughts. The next, and you have to write a minimum of 2 there. Then you would list expressive coping skills. Some people like to journal, draw, some knit. I was speaking with someone and I saw that they have like an anime character as like their picture representative of themselves. And I was like, hey, do you like anime? Do you like to write your own anime? And so that was an expressive coping skill. So taking what you see from them and using it. And if they can't think of any, it would be ideal if they can think of some themselves. But sometimes you have to help them. So you just use information that you know about them, or, even information like I've done a number of safety plans at this point. So just using information I got from previous clients of like, okay, someone likes to knit. Let me suggest knitting to this person. And trying to help them list a minimum of 2. After you have the coping skills, you come up with 5 concrete steps a client will then agree to take when they're feeling unsafe or feeling in crisis and they really want to enact their plan. And then you use that information, the information that you've already collected, to create the 5-step plan for what you want to do when those warning signs happen. So when you're talking to say, okay, when the warning sign of a clouded mind comes up, what would you want to do as step 1? And then say step 1 didn't work, say it was look at TikTok. What would you do if looking at TikTok doesn't work? And you go down the line. Step 5, when you get to step 5, that should always be an emergency services plan. So that could be calling a crisis line, calling the police, going to a hospital yourself. It should always, or calling your therapist directly, depending on the relationship that you have and the hours and things like that. That step 5 should always be an emergency service plan. When you are doing steps 1 through 5, and when you are doing including their numbers, it's important to include actual phone numbers so that the client doesn't think, okay, I should call Grace, but I don't know Grace's phone number and they don't have to look for it. I want it to be like all in one place and be easy for them to find and access. After you have the 5-step plan, focus on something slightly more positive, is listing the reasons they deserve to live, to remind themselves during the crisis. I know this can be hard for people who are in crisis, but it is important to try to think of reasons that you should be alive. Some people, it could be it would make my parents sad. It would make, my partner sad. It would, I want to stay alive for my pets. I have literally had people say, I want to stay alive to find out what happens next in Mandalorian. Whatever you have to do, like that's a reason that you want to live, because you want to see the next thing that is going to happen. Finally, you have the clients verbally agree to things at the end of the safety plan, and they will check them off. They check off that they promise to remain clean and sober until the crisis passes, that they will follow medical advice, and that's like their medication. They're not going to take a handful of pills when they're prescribed 2 a day. They commit to removing or seeing the removal of the means of suicide. That one's super important if they have like an active plan and they have the weapon. They commit to not harming themselves or killing themselves accidentally or on purpose. They commit to calling and talking to our office, a hotline, a mental health provider, or a responsible person in case of a crisis. They follow the step, they commit to following the steps of the safety plan, and they commit to calling 911 or proceed to the nearest mental health facility in the event of an imminent safety risk. These are all things that they will do, or if you can, I have actually done it. A client did have something, an item that they wanted to use, they planned to use to kill themselves. And I sat on the screen and we called at Stetson, they're called public safety. We called public safety together and I sat on the camera with the client until public safety came and removed the means of suicide. Some reminders: have the client save this file or screenshot it to their phone, print it out, keep it on the wall, keep it with them, save it on the computer, whatever they have to do, but it always needs to be readily available to them when they are in crisis. Throughout the entire time of making the safety plan and at the end of it, you want to ensure the client is open to and willing to follow the plan. If they seem hesitant or unwilling to follow the plan, that's when you would definitely be considering hospitalization options. Or if this is really, because this may not work, if they're seeming like, I really can't think of anything. Sometimes they just have a block, but sometimes it's like, I'm just not going to do this. So assessing that throughout. And something that we've noticed through all the safety plans we've done is sometimes clients are just excited to have a plan so that they have a way to handle things themselves. It empowers them, because before they couldn't think of anything else. They were just like, I should die, but they didn't know what else they could do instead. This gives them something that they can do. So like I said, I was going to show you our paperwork. So our clients, before every appointment, they are directed to come to this site. Here's the pre-appointment paperwork where the collaborators would be in the informed consent. Before every single session, we have them do a CCAPS. If it's their first session, it's a CCAPS 62. If it's later, it's a CCAPS 34. It's just a shorter version. Scrolling to the bottom, they can click on safety plan. I would have them share their screen. I'm just going to make this up. They would put that in. Next. And then this is our safety plan. And it's everything step by step of what I just went over, but I wanted to show it to you to make sure. Here's the warning signs we talked about, and it makes them put in one, their therapist or the support people, and it makes them put this information in, the hotline numbers I told you about, putting in the coping skills, distraction coping skills. And we give them 8 options, but we require 2. The expressive coping skills, same, 8, but require 2. Steps 1 through 5, all of these are absolutely necessary. Reasons to live, all of that is absolutely necessary. And then this is what I was talking about. The client verbally agrees to all of these things. And that paperwork then comes directly to us. We save it for confidentiality. We put a password to it, send it to them, and they then have access to their safety plan.
So before we go into hospitalizations, I saw we had a couple of questions. So I'm going to look at them, and then Grace and Angela, if you want to jump in on any of these, you can. But the first one is from Kristen asking, so this was back when we were talking about confidentiality and people being in the car and stuff with your clients. So she said, how do you handle situations when they're with other people? So I can say, me personally, I'll just, remind them of confidentiality and what this time is for, and see what they want to do. I'm a bit more firm about them being on their own, just because we're not going to be able to talk about whatever it is they want to talk about openly. So it's a little bit of a conversation with them, and then just letting them know, we can reschedule, or if you need 10 minutes, that's fine. We have 50 minutes. So if you need to go set yourself up somewhere, it's all good. I don't know, Grace or Angela, if you have anything to add to that one.
Yeah, so yeah, I've had like random happenings with like someone's parents in the background, didn't know they were there, like really random things. Because when you're virtual, sometimes clients can put up a background on their computer and you don't always know where they are. But usually, kind of like Nicole said, I'll remind them confidentiality, but usually how I say it is like, you know, I can ensure your confidentiality, but it's up to you to also ensure your own, since they're not in a room with me. So I also ask that they go somewhere private if they can. If not, and this really is like all they've got, it's like, okay, all right. But for the most part, I've never had anyone be like, oh no, this is all I have. So yeah,
Mhm.
flat out tell them like, no, don't do that.
I have not run into this situation yet. The way that I see it, though, is something that I learned in my telehealth training, is that you then, if the client is not by themselves, you then say, okay, well, per our first session, we talked about you needing confidentiality. So if you can't be alone right now, why don't we go ahead and reschedule a time? And that kind of forces them to take responsibility for it. I see someone was saying that the only time they have is when they're driving in their car to pick up their kids, which can be great. That's what's convenient about teletherapy. The problem with that is, like, if they were coming to your office, they would have to have that time, and that's kind of what you want to do. Even when they're on a virtual platform, like, they reserve this time for counseling, and they said that they were going to be alone, and they committed to that. So that's kind of my take, but again, I haven't put it in practice, so I don't know the real how realistic this idea of being like, okay, let's reschedule.
And then the next question, if someone lists a person they only know through social media, so this is for a collaborator, is it okay to put their handle instead of a phone number? Yeah, whatever way they contact them, explicitly putting that method on their safety plan. Because, when you're in the middle of a crisis, you can't think. So, yeah, put the handle on there. And then,
Oh, I was going to add to that. Like, I've definitely have had clients who are like, my group of online community friends, and I'm like, go for it. You know, if that's what they need, that's what they need. It's what works best.
and then does the client verbally commit to these safety plan things while they make it with you, or are they supposed to commit to it themselves, or both? Well, when we get to the bottom part of the safety plan and they check all those boxes, I go through each one with them individually. And I tell them, like, if you're going to check this, check it because you're actually going to do it. The whole point of the safety plan is to help you. It's not for me, it's not what I need. So, the whole time I'm doing it, I'm reminding them we're not just filling this out for a good time or to say that we did it. We're filling it out because it's something to help you. So then they kind of look at it more realistically. So really, I mean, yeah, they're committing to me, but it's not for me. They're just doing it in my presence for themselves so I can help hold them accountable.
And I saw Kristen said, like, scary having that one person talk while they're driving. And, yeah, because we know when people are driving, they're not going to have their full attention on counseling, or if they're counseling and vice versa, they might not be fully focused on driving. And that could be something to bring up with them, is like, for their literal own safety. And the fact that you as a counselor don't feel comfortable with that, because our role is to do no harm. And if that's a situation where you're afraid continuing to hold that session with them will do them harm, you have every right to reschedule and put your foot down and be like, no, we can't do this, for your own benefit.
Yes. And I had one student, she was driving by herself, but she was driving on I-4, which it's one of the busiest, most dangerous roads in Florida, actually all of America. And she also was crying. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to go on mute. And once you park somewhere, it was during the day, so it was okay. But I said, once you park somewhere where you feel safe, then I'll turn my camera on and we can continue. So there's a lot of different scenarios that happen. You just kind of have to use your best judgment and just think about it. So I didn't think it was good for her to drive on I-4 crying, talking to me. So she had to stop. She stopped at a gas station. Yes, so we'll continue and we'll have some time at the end for questions. I'll try to do this part quickly. So let's say you've gone through all the things we talked about, you've done safety planning, and the person's still just like, yeah, this isn't going to work for me. So then we go to hospitalization. So there's voluntary where they go on their own will, which in my opinion is the best way. And then there's involuntary against their will. So knowing the different laws and procedures, like I said in the very beginning, in your specific state, very important to know that. And then the pros and cons to voluntary versus involuntary hospitalizations. So a lot of people that we have been hospitalized in the past, and a lot of them have had bad experiences because they've been hospitalized under the Baker Act, which is involuntary. So sometimes they have a bad experience with whoever was the one who took them in. So let's say that the person you're with needs to be hospitalized. If you can explain to them the difference between going on their own and then like having an officer come and take them, even though they're not arrested or they're not in trouble, a lot of times they're still put in handcuffs and still put in the back of a police car. It's just not a good time. So I try to explain to them, you know, like your friend can come and take you, and maybe they'll sign a release of information so that their friend can come into the session and their friend can tell me, all right, I'm going to drive so-and-so to the hospital and they'll call you when we get there. And a lot of times if you can explain it to them and you personally are comfortable with explaining it, then they're going to be feeling better about the whole process. But if you're nervous about it and don't exactly know how it's going to go down, they can sense that and it's not going to help. So then you're like, oh, Nicole, how do I do that? How do I become comfortable with that? So go to the next slide, please, Grace. Thank you. So knowing what you have available, it's very important. I know because I've worked at a lot of these places, so I know how they operate. But, you know, before COVID, a lot of them would do site visits. So you could go. We have a class specifically in our counselor education program called Community Mental Health, where the students do go and they visit the different places in our community. But if you can't do that in person right now, maybe they have a virtual option. But at least knowing what is there, like what places do hospitalizations and voluntary and involuntary. And then connecting with organization partners to build relationships. So our process is a lot more streamlined because we know specific people that work in these places, and we can call them and say, you know, hey, do you have any beds available? Because again, another bad time is you have somebody who is in crisis and they agreed, okay, I'm going to go voluntarily. And then they show up to the place and there's no beds available. That's kind of a knockdown. So we try to do a lot on the back end before they even leave. And this is a team approach too. So I'm not doing all of this by myself. I might have, if you can, I might have somebody else helping me, like maybe another counselor or the admin making the calls while I talk to the person. And then why? So like I mentioned briefly before, being able to describe the process, describe the location, what it looks like clearly and confidently, because if you have that within yourself when you're explaining it to the person, it's going to help with how they see it. And then counselor confidence when dealing with an already difficult situation. So, I mean, this is stressful for you too, but if you already know what you have available in your community, then it's kind of like your own safety plan. You know what to do in your own crisis. And then assurance for client. And I know we only have a couple minutes left. So, questions.
I did want to add with the pros and cons. So something that I mean, I know at the Chicago school, we talk about commitment and how that's like an option. I feel like we're really worried about them, but at least I wasn't fully aware until I came to Stetson that voluntary commitment is a thing. And I've talked to, other professionals who work at Baker Act facilities or involuntary facilities, and many of the employees will tell you that the clients are traumatized when they're Baker acted involuntarily. I am not in any way saying do not involuntarily commit them if they need to be. Absolutely, because it's for their best, it's for their health. But also at the same time, like, understand that we don't want to do it willy-nilly. There are consequences. It can be traumatizing for the client. So, you want to make sure to explore your options with the client, so to speak, as Nicole was kind of going over.
Yeah, it's a conversation, again, this whole thing is collaborative. One of the questions was, how do you find balance between making the safety plan for their benefit versus having a safety plan on file for liability reasons?
I feel like everything we do has liability tied to it in some form or fashion, but that kind of brings up the question, like, are you doing things just because you want to cover your own self? Or are you actually doing things because you think they'll benefit the client, So part of that is like, why are you doing what you're doing? But also, like Grace mentioned earlier, safety plans don't hurt. It's not like you're involuntarily sending them to the hospital or breaking confidentiality or anything. It's just, it's collaborating on like, hey, what can we do to help you in this moment? And it doesn't hurt to make one, even if you're not sure. It's the rather be safe than sorry. And when it's something like this, where you're like, there is no risk involved in making a safety plan, go for it, because it really could benefit the client. And if you're covering all your bases, you most likely are covering all the liability aspects of that as well. And I hope that answered your question.
For me personally, I know that, like, I guess maybe in my unconscious, like, I know it's a liability thing, but in like my conscious mind, when I'm doing it, I'm doing this for the client. I've seen afterwards, like in follow-up sessions, how this helps the client, how it empowers the client. So in my mind, by creating it, I'm doing this more for them. Yes, it helps. It helps. What is it? Cover your butt or something? Like, yes, it does that. But I'm in my mind mentally, like, I am doing this for their benefit, not for my own. This helps them. This gives them a tool that they may not have been aware of before.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming to this and listening to us, and hopefully it helps you.
So
All right. Thank you all for presenting. I definitely enjoyed that. I'm sure many people did find this helpful. I do want to say, as the room monitor,